Now, Janine, you represented an intervener in this case. What did the Women's Equity Coalition argue in this Ontario case?
So the Women's Equality Coalition is a collection of women's groups from across the country who argued in this case, first of all, that prostitution is both a cause and a consequence of inequality, sex inequality principally, but also inequality on the basis of race and indigeneity. And they argued that men don't have a constitutional right to buy sex. They don't have a constitutional right to profit from the prostitution of women, and that they shouldn't be allowed to hide behind the asserted rights of women. I mean, they're completely invisible in this case, but they're the ones who are targeted by this legislation. And finally, my clients argued that to remove these laws and effectively privatize women's security is actually very dangerous, and that it doesn't assist women who are stuck in prostitution to be left simply to fend for themselves.
Now, the legal challenge sort of focused on three rights. There were how the advertising prohibitions and communicating provisions violate, they said, the right to freedom of expression. There was the allegation that the laws or the argument that the laws make sex workers less safe and violate their Section 7 Charter right to life, liberty, and security. And then they also argued that the laws had a disproportionate impact on Indigenous, racialized, and trans women, that they were more likely to suffer as a result of these laws. Now, did the court find that any of these provisions violated any of these rights?
Well, no. I mean, at the end of the day, the court upheld all of the provisions, found that the Section 7 violation wasn't made out, found that any infringements of 2B, freedom of expression, were reasonable limits on that right, and said this isn't a violation of Section 15. The inequality that is rife in prostitution comes from the industry and is inflicted on these vulnerable women by buyers and pimps. It's not the result of the laws.
Now, as I said in the introduction, the starting point here is that sex work is not legal. The purchase of sex is prohibited, but the sellers are immune. The women selling sex are immune from prosecution. But you've written about how police and parole officers actually, the way they work on the ground is they act like selling sex is legal. They don't enforce prohibitions. And you've argued that enforcing prohibitions on Johns or the purchasers of sex, that could save lives. Can you explain how?
Well, it's important to recognize that enforcement of these laws is incredibly uneven across the country, and certainly where I am here in British Columbia, police in Vancouver in particular have been quite overt in saying that they're not interested in enforcing the laws against Johns, except maybe occasionally when children are involved and being purchased. And so the result of that is that,
Maybe.
men are given the message, right, that they're going to get away with this, that they can engage in this activity with impunity. And we've seen in so many cases, we had a notorious pimp here in Vancouver, Mr. Moazami, who was convicted of a number of really quite horrific offenses in relation to teenage girls and young women. They had the names of many of his customers, and not a single man was prosecuted. And it's these guys that create the demand, right, for the pimps to recruit these girls. And without interfering with that demand, then the behavior escalates. And we saw
Right.
that in the Barton case involving Cindy Gladue. We saw it in the Picton case involving all of those women in the downtown east side. These men were known Johns. People understood that they were purchasing women for sex, and nobody interfered until it was much too late.
Now, the court said in this case that the question of whether or not sex work is inherently exploitive is not relevant to the analysis. We've got to go to commercial break, but when we come back, I want to talk about that because the court said it's not relevant, but they sure did spend a lot of time talking about it and talking about the issues of recruitment, coercion, and trafficking. So I want to get your reaction to the court's statement about that, and then on a policy level to the link between sex work, human trafficking, and coercion. We'll be right back.